Good morning, America. On the 19th of May, 2026, Russia issued its harshest demand yet: complete Ukrainian withdrawal from the entire Donbas as a non-negotiable precondition for any ceasefire. At the same time, Moscow has nearly 600,000 troops deployed along the front lines, the largest concentration of Russian forces since World War II. Yet despite this aggressive diplomatic posture, Russia's military plan is collapsing on the ground. What Putin hoped would be a position of overwhelming strength is rapidly turning into one of visible desperation. Behind these high-stakes demands are hundreds of thousands of families on both sides living every day in fear, grief, and uncertainty. Tell me in the comments, do you believe Russia's massive troop numbers will force Ukraine to accept harsh terms, or will battlefield realities break Putin's demands? While Russia loudly demands total Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbas as a precondition for peace, its military reality on the ground tells a completely different and far more desperate story. Russia's main strategic objective this spring and summer was to smash through Ukraine's heavily fortified fortress belt, the critical urban-industrial corridor stretching from Kostiantynivka through Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Sloviansk. Putin believed this breakthrough would deliver the decisive victory he desperately needs. Instead, the fortress belt has become a catastrophic meat grinder for the Russian army. In the past 6 months, Russia has sacrificed nearly 100,000 soldiers killed or severely wounded to capture only around 350 square kilometers of territory. That is an 80% slower advance rate compared to the same period last year. In Donetsk Oblast alone, seizing just 53 square kilometers has cost Russian forces over 25,000 soldiers, a horrifying ratio of nearly 500 men per square kilometer. Elite units are being shredded and frantically shuffled between fronts. The once formidable 90th Tank Division, for example, was pulled from the Pokrovsk axis and rushed south to plug holes near Vuhledar, only to suffer heavy losses again. Russian commanders are now forced into constant emergency redeployments, weakening one sector to save another. This is not the lightning offensive Putin envisioned. This is a slow, grinding, extremely expensive failure. The fortress belt, built with concrete bunkers, layered minefields, drone kill zones, and determined Ukrainian defenders, has turned Russia's superior numbers into a liability rather than an advantage. Every failed assault, every burned tank, and every lost battalion further erodes Russia's remaining combat power. What was supposed to be a position of overwhelming military strength is rapidly becoming a position of strategic exhaustion. And behind these cold military statistics lies a tragic human reality. On the Russian side, thousands of families across Buryatia, Dagestan, and Siberia continue to receive grim death notices. On the Ukrainian side, entire communities living near the fortress belt endure constant shelling, destroyed homes, and the daily terror of survival. Children grow up knowing the sound of explosions better than the sound of peace. Russia's grand spring-summer offensive was meant to break Ukraine. Instead, Ukraine's defenses are breaking Russia. While Russia bleeds itself dry against Ukraine's fortress belt in Donetsk, a very different story is unfolding on other parts of the front. One that shows Ukraine is no longer just holding the line, but actively seizing the initiative. Ukraine has perfected a highly effective tactical model: hold, clear, fortify. First, they hold key defensive positions. Then, using coordinated small unit assaults, drones, and special forces, they clear Russian infiltrators from gray zones. Finally, they rapidly fortify the newly recaptured ground to prevent Russia from taking it back. This model is working with deadly efficiency across multiple fronts. In the Zaporizhzhia direction, Ukrainian forces have achieved significant breakthroughs around Huliai Pole and Oleksandrivka. Since the beginning of April 2026, they have recaptured approximately 244 square kilometers and liberated 9 to 12 settlements. Ukrainian troops have pushed forward to within just 2 kilometers of critical logistical roads, including the vital Huliapole-Velika Novosilka route. Russian supply convoys are now under constant threat. At the same time, Ukrainian long-range drones and special forces are conducting deep strikes far behind Russian lines. In the Mariupol area, Ukrainian forces have successfully hit targets 100 to 160 kilometers from the front, destroying fuel depots, ammunition warehouses, and command posts. These strikes are creating serious logistical bottlenecks for Russian forces trying to sustain their operations. Ukraine is no longer purely defensive. through smart, low-cost, asymmetric tactics. Swarms of FPV drones, ground robots, coordinated special forces raids, and precision artillery, they are forcing Russia into a reactive posture. Every Russian advance in one sector is met with Ukrainian counterpressure in another. Moscow is constantly forced to shift elite units from one crisis to the next, burning through reserves and losing momentum. This tactical evolution is impressive. What Russia hoped would be a war of attrition favoring the larger army has become a war of intelligence and adaptability, one where Ukraine is currently outperforming its much larger opponent. But beyond the maps and military analysis, there is a deeply human side to these gains. Every kilometer Ukrainian forces reclaim means families can begin returning to their partially destroyed villages. Children who have spent years in basements or displaced across the country can start dreaming again of going back to school. Farmers can return to fields that have been battlegrounds. A fragile but real sense of hope is slowly being restored in communities that have endured years of occupation and constant fighting. Ukraine is not only pushing Russia back on the battlefield, it is pushing back against despair and slowly reclaiming its future, meter by meter. While Ukrainian ground forces are making steady tactical gains in Zaporizhzhia and pushing back Russian infiltrators in the northeast, something even more dangerous is happening far behind Russian lines. Ukraine has turned Russia's rear areas into an active battlefield. In the past 6 weeks, Ukrainian long-range drones have conducted over 180 deep strikes into occupied territories. Key targets include the critical Jankoy railway junction in northern Crimea, which was hit 7 times in May alone. Major fuel depots near Mariupol were struck on May 11th and May 17th, destroying an estimated 4,800 tons of diesel and aviation fuel. S-400 air defense batteries near Tokmak and Melitopol have been repeatedly targeted, with at least 3 systems confirmed destroyed or heavily damaged. Ukrainian drones are now regularly operating 100 to 160 kilometers behind the front line. They are systematically hunting Russian supply convoys along the T-509 and M14 highways, Russia's 2 most important logistical arteries in the south. On May 19th, a single drone strike destroyed 27 fuel tankers near Berdyansk, causing a massive fire that burned for over 14 hours. This is drone-era battlefield air interdiction at its most effective. What traditional air forces struggled to achieve, Ukraine is accomplishing with relatively cheap, intelligent, and highly adaptable drones. Russian rear areas that were once considered relatively safe are now under constant threat. Logistical bottlenecks are growing severe. Russian units at the front are reporting increasing delays in ammunition, fuel, and spare parts. Some brigades have been forced to ration artillery shells, while others are struggling to move reinforcements quickly due to damaged rail lines and highways. Russia's once formidable logistical machine is slowly being strangled. The psychological effect is enormous. Russian soldiers who once felt relatively safe 100 kilometers from the front are now looking over their shoulders constantly. Command centers that used to operate with confidence are now forced to move frequently. The entire Russian supply network in southern Ukraine is under sustained pressure. For the civilians living in occupied areas, the situation is equally grim. As Russian logistics crumble, shortages of food, medicine, and fuel are becoming more common. The occupation that once promised stability is becoming increasingly unsustainable and chaotic. Ukraine is not just reclaiming territory on the front lines, it is systematically dismantling Russia's ability to hold the land it already occupies. By turning the rear into an extension of the battlefield, Ukraine is forcing Russia to fight a 2-front war, one against Ukrainian soldiers at the line of contact and another against Ukrainian drones deep in the rear. This is modern warfare at its most sophisticated, and Ukraine is mastering it. While Ukrainian drones tear apart Russian supply lines deep in the rear, the true scale of Moscow's crisis is becoming visible not on the battlefield, but inside Russia itself. The manpower shortage has reached catastrophic levels. Recruitment of new contract soldiers has fallen by 20% compared to the same period last year. In the first 4 months of 2026, Russia managed to recruit only 68,000 new soldiers instead of the targeted 110,000, despite offering signing bonuses as high as $52,000 in some regions. The quality of recruits is also collapsing. Over 61% now come from prisons, impoverished regions, or with minimal training. Secret purges within the Ministry of Defense continue, with at least 14 senior officers removed or arrested since March for defeatist attitudes and corruption. Industrial production is equally strained. Due to Western sanctions, Russia cannot replace its lost modern equipment at anywhere near the rate it is being destroyed. In April alone, the Russian army lost 187 main battle tanks, but could only produce or refurbish 41 T-72, B-3, and T-90M tanks. The once mighty Russian tank fleet is now heavily dependent on pulling 1960s-era T-62s out of storage. Putin's remaining strategic cards are rapidly losing value. A new wave of mobilization would risk massive domestic unrest. The energy war against Europe has largely failed, as the EU has diversified supplies. Diplomatic efforts are stalling because Russia's battlefield position is weakening. Even nuclear saber-rattling is losing credibility after repeated empty threats. The Belarus card is also creating more problems than solutions. Lukashenko's selective mobilization, announced on May 12th, has triggered quiet protests in several Belarusian cities and increased desertion rates within the Belarusian army. Many Belarusian soldiers openly resent being used as cannon fodder for Russian ambitions. The gap between Kremlin rhetoric and battlefield reality has never been wider. While Putin continues to claim victory is near, his army is consuming itself faster than it can regenerate. Internal repression is intensifying, economic strain is mounting, and the Russian people are growing increasingly exhausted with a war that offers no clear end. Behind these cold statistics lies a tragic human cost. Young Russian men from poor regions are being sent to die in a conflict many no longer believe in. Mothers in Siberia and the Far East continue to receive death notices, while the children of Moscow elites remain untouched. The Russian people are being asked to sacrifice their future, their economy, their young men, and their stability for territorial fantasies that grow more distant with every passing month. Russia is not just fighting Ukraine on the battlefield. It is fighting a losing battle against its own exhaustion, isolation, and internal decay. After weeks of intense fighting and strategic maneuvering, the bigger picture in mid-2026 is now unmistakable. Russia went into negotiations demanding complete Ukrainian withdrawal from Donbas as a non-negotiable precondition. Yet on the battlefield, its military momentum is collapsing. What was supposed to be a position of strength has become a position of growing desperation. Putin's army is losing ground, burning through elite reserves, and facing a smarter, more adaptive Ukrainian force that is shifting the war into a long-term attrition phase where technology, logistics, and innovation clearly favor the defender. Putin's repeated claim that time is on our side is crumbling before our eyes. Russia is trapped in a strategic deadlock of its own making. It can still inflict pain, but it is struggling to achieve any meaningful strategic progress. Every month that passes, Russia becomes weaker, poorer, and more isolated, while Ukraine grows more experienced, better equipped, and more united with its international partners. The grand Russian plan to break Ukraine through sheer mass and brutality is unraveling. The fortress belt in Donetsk has held. The M14 highway to Crimea is under sustained pressure. Russian logistics are being strangled by deep drone strikes. And now, even the northern flank is turning into a liability rather than an advantage. This war has already claimed far too many lives on both sides. Russian families continue to receive death notices for a conflict that offers no clear victory. Ukrainian communities endure constant shelling, destroyed homes, and the daily struggle for survival. Every tactical Ukrainian success and every logistical Russian failure brings the distant hope of peace a little closer, a peace where Ukrainians can finally rebuild their cities and Russian families can stop sending their sons to the competing their life front. The real victory will not be measured in kilometers of territory, but in the moment both nations can choose life over endless conflict. Ukraine has shown the world that determination, creativity, and the will to be free can challenge even the largest aggressor. Russia is learning at a terrible cost that brute force alone is no longer enough in modern warfare. The coming months will be decisive, but one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The momentum has shifted, and it is shifting in Ukraine's favor.